My name is Eric Tinker, and I would like to welcome you to the Future of Data-Driven Storytelling panel hosted by PAX Solaria. I am the Director of Business Development for the Spry Group, a software development agency, and I work with every single one of these panelists on occasion. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight to my first panelist. This is Erica Willis from CoClear.
Hello. Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to give you guys a brief introduction to basically our startup does lifecycle analytics, and I'll explain why we consider this to be an important thing to do. And let's see, where's my agenda slide? Explain how product innovation is a good sustainability goal for our data analytics tool, and then also basically talk about some of my favorite data visualization, which I think tells really great stories. So, just a bit of doom and gloom. So why we do lifecycle analytics of products, which basically captures greenhouse gases through every stage of a product's life, and then our application correlates this with financial data to help brands make better business decisions. Why we decided to do this is you've probably heard at some point that we're currently using 1.5 planets in our global consumption. And what this means is that it takes the Earth 1 year and 6 months to regenerate what we consume in a year. So the population is growing, and the percentage of the population in the world that's getting access to electricity and water, say in the developing world, this is growing as well. This is important, but we face this interesting challenge where we have to use less to make more, and then we're going to have to use less again. So our application is trying to help product innovation. So just briefly, why we consider product innovation to help meet the challenges of resource scarcity is that it's going to be very much important focus for brands to start understanding for the materials that they use, what are the geographic concentrations of supply, what are the impacts of any substitutes they might want to try out, what's the political stability of their supply regions, and are there any reuse and recycling strategies. So a group out of Yale University looked at the criticality of metals and metalloids, and using the computer industry as an example, you can identify that 90% of rare earth metals are currently coming from China. There aren't any adequate substitutes for iridium, which is used in cell phone displays. The political stability of supply regions like the Congo are huge, and a great amount of electronics materials come out of there. And one specifically is the tantalum from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so the thing is, as these rare earth metals get rarer, it's also going to be important for product designers to work out disassembling and recycling models so you can reuse these materials without constantly trying to mine for them. So that's sort of why our company CoClear is basically trying to address resource scarcity and greenhouse gas emissions through the life cycle analyses of products. And our goal is to help brands make better products, both financially and environmentally. So just briefly, our methodology came out of Columbia University. We're a startup out of Columbia University. And basically, it was the methodology was created to do life cycle analysis at scale. Because as you can imagine, life cycle analysis is a lot of data you need to gather. And it came out of a grant for PepsiCo, the methodology, where about 4,000 products of PepsiCo's were assessed. And the methodology allows this to happen far more quickly than the general life cycle analysis approach. So, Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, so we don't need to, if we can just jump back to the deck. Yeah. Cool, sorry about that. So basically we work with sustainability teams, research and development teams, procurement teams, and marketing teams. And here's sort of a glimpse of some of our reports. I'll go into some details in a moment about what kind of data visualizations we use, because that's the name of the game today. But briefly, what life cycle analysis is, like I said before, it calculates the greenhouse gas emissions across the life of a product. So this is raw materials, packaging, production, transportation, retail, consumer use, and disposal. And as you can imagine, if you've done a life cycle analysis of a product in your brand or entire brand's worth of products, you're essentially mapping your supply chain. So you start to get some really fun data to play with. So the one point of difference at our company, before I move on to data visualization, is that what we do is we take the life cycle stages, plus the energy, water, and solid waste that's produced at a factory. We correlate all this data with real-world company costs, and then we use data visualizations to help brands explore their products and the data of their products. So an example of how this could be interesting across a brand is if you say are looking to substitute a problematic ingredient, and you've got a brand, say like PepsiCo, with over 3,000 products, 211 brands in 5 countries. It's like, well, if I make one material change, how's that going to affect my entire enterprise? What's it going to mean in terms of my cost? What's going to mean in terms of my environmental impact? How many products will be affected? How many brands will be affected? Like, what does this do to my supply chain? So we ran the methodology in its development phase ran a substitution on an ingredient and found out that one change of one material was going to affect 125 products and 7 brands. And the thing is, when you start to play around with the data in your supply chain, is sometimes not intuitive findings get revealed. So for this material substitution, we were looking at production in Brazil, so a Brazilian factory. Currently, the material was being sourced from Indonesia and shipped over to Brazil. And the scenario that was run was, what if we source this new material, a different material, from Brazil for the Brazilian production? And counterintuitively, it turns out that by going to a new material from Brazil for Brazilian production, you're going to increase your annual procurement costs by 7 to 10%, which is like the tens of millions for someone like PepsiCo. And also you're going to see basically about an 8% in life cycle emissions increase, because basically in transportation, trucking has a higher impact than ship transport. Also, the fertilizers used on the new material were far more intensive to the environment than the existing material. So it's kind of interesting when you start running numbers at scale. But going to today's topic, data visualization, which has always been a pet love of mine, and so I was very excited when I got to work on CodeClear's web analytics, is a really exciting field for me, I think, because basically you're trying to like tell stories with data without creating any bias wherever possible. So many of you may have heard of what I consider the godfather of knowledge for data visualizations or data graphics. His name's Edward Tufte. And basically he has several books. He does workshops and presentations, and he basically is a sort of definitive voice on critiquing data visualizations. And I'll just touch on a couple of points and goals that he highly recommends whenever you're going to design or criticize a data graphic or a data visualization. And so the goals are to make large data sets coherent, reveal the data that you have at several levels of detail. So basically you can get a bird's eye view and then start drilling deeper and deeper and deeper. And then avoid distorting what the data has to say. So a quote here from him is that excellence in statistical graphics consists of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency. Graphics reveal data. That's my man, Tufte. And so some tips for designing data graphics are maximize data ink. And what data ink is, any bit of ink that communicates information is data ink. So a point on a graph is data ink. But like a drop shadow, that's not data ink. Or like a thought bubble, that's not data ink. Or like making a line look 3D, that's not data ink, in the sense of if it's not valuable information, if it's just a design flourish, it's not data ink. And if you're looking at a graphic where the data ink is less than 50%, you're not really looking at a good data graphic. Also, he recommends to maximize content reasoning and limit the design reasoning. So if you're looking at a graphic that has several keys and lots of explanation on how to decipher what each symbol and sign means, that's too much. That's the design reasoning, and you're not actually being left to explore the data. So it should be basically almost transparent. You should approach a data graphic and not have to teach yourself how to read the data graphic. It should be a relatively intuitive process. He also recommends to save the graphics for big data and use sentences for little data. So the New York Times, who is basically, I think, one of the best publications for data visualizations, they do this really well. If a piece of information, if all you need to say is 90% of the population don't like pink elephants, you don't need a data graphic for that. That's the statement. It works really well. All the data you're trying to convey is in that sentence. So just where possible, if you can say what you want to communicate in a sentence, just do it. Don't create a graphic for graphic's sake. And also, a good chart should tell 1,000 words. So you can always get that when you get to reveal, when data reveals trends. It's always a wonderful and fascinating experience when you discover something that you previously hadn't expected. But also, with a really great data graphic, a user ideally should spend the amount of time it takes them to read 1,000 words. Ideally, you want them spending that amount of time with your graphic. So it's the idea of that it really gives the user something to really digest, explore, and ideally take away something perhaps that you weren't even necessarily intending them to, and they get to reflect on it themselves. So just briefly, some of my sort of favorite use cases of data-driven journalism. So data-driven journalism wasn't necessarily started by WikiLeaks, but WikiLeaks definitely gave journalists and readers a new approach to digesting the news, in that it didn't only provide journalists with data sets, those journalists then provided those data sets to their readers. So when you were reading about the diplomatic cables or the Iraq war logs, not only did you get great data visualizations and really interesting reporting, but The Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, all the groups that were privy to that data made that data set available to their readers. So it increases transparency and reduces corruption when you're talking about the news, which is amazing. And also reveals things perhaps that the government wasn't really pushing the news groups to communicate. So here's an example of from the Iraqi war logs. And so this was in 2010. WikiLeaks released these Iraq war logs, which was basically the greatest military classified data leak in history at the time. And each one of the data points collected was called a SIG act, a significant act of war, documented by the soldiers in Iraq. So it's over 100,000 deaths. Over 60% of these were civilian casualties. And what we're looking at the moment, the deadly day in Baghdad, which was a piece run in the New York Times, basically it was before the American surge under the Bush administration, but each one of those circles is documenting the number of deaths and the nature of the deaths of the people of that day. And so what the Iraqi war logs did, not only did it give you an account of, say, the number of civilian deaths, but it also demonstrated some actually pretty terrible things. It contradicted that the claims that the United States government didn't keep a record of its civilians killed, which it did. There was evidence to suggest that the US government ignored evidence and practices of torture. It revealed unreported instances of the US forces killing civilians at checkpoints and during operations. And also it had a huge indication of Iran's involvement in Iraq. We're basically looking at insurgents being trained and using weapons provided by the IRGC. So again, a bit grim, but also really sort of flexing the transparency muscle. So then, just on a slightly more lightweight demonstration, this is the New York Times 4 Ways to Slice the Obama's 2013 budget proposal. So if we just jump over, it's just really, really cool interaction. So, okay, hold on a second. Is the mouse over there?
Can you just use the scroll wheel?
The scroll. Oh, okay. Okay, so where's the mouse? Oh, there we are. Hang on. Sorry, bear with me. So these are all the different types of spending in the budget of the year. So we have here, types of spending. So that's mandatory and that's discretionary. Then we have the changes. So obviously above the line, the departments have the more significant changes than below the line. So up here, it's kind of positive. So that was education went up by 25%, though the bubble is pretty small, but the spending went up. Which is good. And then you have department totals. So these are all the different ways that the money's being spent. Anyway, I think really cool data graphic. So that's one of them. So can we jump back to the deck?
Sure.
And again, I'm sort of wrapping up here. Bear with me. This is a really great a guy who teaches out of Pratt University, Ben Wellington, and basically it's called iQuant New York, and he takes, so if you may or may not know, the New York City government publishes a huge amount of open data sets about all sorts of things, like the number of dog parks in New York, to up here we have the percentage of rent stabilization and whether it's increasing or decreasing. And so this is just one example from the blog of, and these are all interactive. I'm just not going to bore you with me jumping around them. But basically, he's got a great line that, you know, every data set that the city releases tells a story. And so he takes them all and correlates them and visualizes them, and they're super good. Highly recommend checking them out. And I'm probably sort of taking up too much time, so I won't really go into too much other stuff. So a lot of the charts I've showed you and the charts that we use in my our CodeClear application, which we did develop with Spire Group, use what's called D3 data-driven documents, which are super flexible. They're not just for pretty graphics. You can do amazing statistical operations, geoprojections. You can do like simulators, like particle simulators with them. It's really very, very powerful, a really powerful tool, basically. And so we developed some of our own charts. I called this one Rainbow Orbs, which is basically trying to show people for every material and packaging in their products how many greenhouse gases are incurring, but also at what different life cycle stages. So here what you're looking at is the blue is the material or packaging itself, and the purple is the transportation, like from delivering it to the factory, and the green is its end of life. Is it recycled? Is it incinerated? We also did like double bar charts to compare annual greenhouse gas emissions of a product to its per unit emissions. Just to summarize, and I know I've been a bit of a rapid fire speaker here, but basically at CodeClear, our goal with our data visualization is to help brands identify the financial and environmental hotspots across their supply chains. We hope to inform product design with the data storytelling that we do, and we want to help brands track progress towards their sustainability goals and ideally create transparency both for regulatory and marketing reasons. With that, I shall pass the mic. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to introduce Debra Anderson from Datavized. Datavized is a data visualization startup. She is the chief strategy officer and co-founder.
Just checking.
There we go.
Oh, okay. There I am. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Eric, for having me here, and it's really wonderful to be on this panel. As Eric said, I'm starting a new virtual reality data visualization startup called Datavized, and I teach at the New School for Public Engagement, an undergraduate research course on big data consumer research. These are some of the kind of broad sweeping topics that I'm researching for the most part, and doing a lot of research and development with tools related to immersive media, augmented reality, virtual reality, and tying in some of these bigger questions around data and privacy and ethics, building empathy using data-driven storytelling and immersive media. So just to give you a little bit background on, I come from an arts background and innovation strategy and consultancy. So I've done a bit of curation, works across data-driven storytelling with the likes of the National Film Board of Canada, had my hand in kind of prototyping some of my own real-time data visualization prototypes, working with creative coders, using processing coding language, which I'll get into a few examples of those. And so I really want to show this slide because I see these things that I've been doing over the last few years as kind of the training wheels for working in the medium of virtual reality, and kind of taking a lot of this thinking around interactive storytelling and big data and data-driven storytelling to the medium of VR. So this project, has anyone experienced the Project Bear 71? Jen. Okay. It's a really fantastic project that debuted in 2012 at the Sundance Film Festival. It's produced by the National Film Board of Canada, the Vancouver division that's run by Lockdow. And this project was really kind of pivotal and I would say pretty much groundbreaking and changing my thinking around data-driven storytelling because it was so successful in that it was the first interactive project that really pushed a lot of the creative use of technology from augmented reality and web-based interactivity with real-time video surveillance and engagement, an adaptation for an installation, all these incredible things that were executed really well, but also a creative use of data. In this particular case was, I think, 10 years of surveillance footage of animals in Banff National Park that were then brought into a story about a particular bear. And we follow the story of Bear 71. And it was incredibly emotional. There were people actually plugged into this project. I think when it first launched, about 70,000 people within the first few weeks that it debuted. And you could literally connect with somebody on the other side of this project who was weeping. So all of this really kind of, for me, made me think in new ways about data and what that meant and how to tell good stories through data-driven narrative. The Art of Information was a project I was working on with my partner Hugh and a code artist, Glenn Marshall, experimenting with just producing kind of art, beautiful art designed with random codes, ones and zeros, to then begin an idea and a concept around what happens when you take this kind of visualization and you plug real data behind it, and what can that look like. So we did a few projects. This is Clouds in Cloudless Skies. There's a great article from the Creators Project about this, a procedural generative animation, and it's a music video. It's also created in processing code language, and I think just looking again at kind of beautiful imagery and ultimately immersive imagery and how we can use working with artists and creative artists and coders and animators, filmmakers and the like to tell data-driven stories in both ways that are beautiful as well as useful. This was another prototype I designed with Chartbeat in a kind of R&D lab experiment, which was looking at the top 10 articles from Gizmodo through their API. This is on Vimeo, and so basically it's taking the feature article image and the top 10 articles and kind of looking at the time at a moving image word cloud. So this is kind of before VR, and just recently I saw the Wall Street Journal designed a guy named Roger there, a really cool virtual reality prototype for headlines and newsrooms. So this is kind of an interesting area in terms of looking at news culture and dashboard visualization, and then where that's all going with immersive journalism and VR. This is a project as well with the National Film Board of Canada that debuted at Storyscapes at the Tribeca Film Festival, and I had the pleasure of producing the Storyscapes installation with the NFB. So this project, Do Not Track, is on the web, donotrack.com, and it's designed directed by Brent Gaylor from previously of Mozilla Foundation. And it's a story about a full interactive experience that's 7 different episodes in which it asks you to input your data into the story to tell you what the web knows about you. So through this series, it reveals all kinds of kind of uncomfortable aspects of the surveillance and economy that we still live in. And here we designed a data literacy survey to collect more data around audiences and attendees' understanding of kind of privacy, surveillance, encryption, and the like. And that project, actually, my students are now taking this data in my course to kind of experiment with insights from these surveys and feed that back into the narrative. This is a great quote my partner pulled out for a Strata talk, which really says a lot about kind of data flow. Everything changes and nothing remains still. and you cannot step twice into the same stream. And that's really what we're thinking about now with immersive reality and seamless reality and how to connect across human-to-machine interfaces and tell stories in meaningful ways. It's the currency of the world we live in. There's what I kind of describe it as the dark matter of the digital universe. We're constantly making the invisible visible and coming up with, I think, pretty creative ways to do that lately. This is the DIKW pyramid, which I think is important to kind of keep reiterating that what is our ultimate goal with storytelling and data-driven narrative is to make the world a better place, glean insights, share knowledge, and lead to wisdom in terms of shared human experience. So story versus narrative, I think data-driven storytelling, we're now with virtual reality and immersive media thinking in a larger context around data-driven narrative in the sense, again, between these human and machine interfaces and seamless reality. So has anyone tried immersive VR or headset design? Okay, a few people. So just a couple of points, in terms of the sense of presence and immersion in virtual reality is a full 360 experience in which what you're looking at is literally replaced by a fully immersive experience and imagery. And there's also, as you'll see in this other image here, haptic controllers being designed that are coming out in 2016 that are allowing interactivity through these stories to become much more natural and gestural. So a lot of buzz has been about the empathy machine in virtual reality, which was a topic that really interested me to kind of look under the media hype and experiment with VR myself in terms of designing a project that was stereoscopic 360-degree live-action VR and beginning to understand how this medium is being used to tell stories through the creative use of VR and immersive experiences, and also to understand how this medium could drive empathy and change and shift bias. And this project will be coming out hopefully in a matter of weeks. You can go to informationdocumentary.com to learn more about that. As you'll see here again, we worked a bit with Glenn Marshall. He's a Belfast-based computer artist and Ars Electronica winner who is working in an art residency at the time with the Arts Council of Northern Ireland to create emergent art. And this is pretty much kind of his take on particle-based physics and animation. Again, kind of really bringing a sense of what potential visualizations in immersive media could take the form of. Just a quick kind of recap into storytelling with virtual reality. You're starting with a blank piece of paper, and this was just transcribing interviews from all of the VR pioneers that I spoke to, and designing a narrative around the topic of empathy and the medium using Sharpies and Post-its. This was just a picture to show you what the actual rig looks like, which I think is kind of interesting to just get to see. This is actually, as far as 12 GoPros, literally where you're experiencing the head-mounted display, you're looking out from this view, 360 degrees. And so an idea around just thinking around data-driven storytelling with VR and having these kind of many eyes, but also as the individual within the experience, the ability to have 100% agency over where you're looking and how you're interacting, which is a brand new kind of form of interactivity that we need to take into account and put the time and effort into designing thoughtfully around this medium. So this project's in two different parts to begin experimenting with data storytelling and data-driven narrative in the context of 360 video, live action, how we then might create multimedia content within these environments. So we're prototyping some different tools and web-based VR prototypes right now to begin to play with that. This is just a quick shot of the 2D imagery in a 3D environment and designing a kind of with Adobe After Effects use. So it's all experimentation, and I think right now it's important to, really encourage experimentation with this medium. There's no right way to do anything right now. And also just to touch on the medium of VR and sensory bandwidth, that this is audio, visual, information that we're dealing with. And so how do we look at data-driven storytelling and narrative from the context of audio? This is as well as visual. So we're working with a lot of sound artists and sound composers to begin to experiment with more abstract ways to visualize big data in these contexts. And just to kind of give more reference to VR now kind of getting more into kind of a mainstream fashion, this is a New Zealand marketing project where they used Kellogg's cereal to literally distribute virtual reality headsets in cereal boxes. So it's becoming ubiquitous, and the technology in terms of the hardware close to free. Ben Wellington, another kind of a favorite reference of mine as well, as Erica's, is in my course, I like to share this with my students to just kind of, again, bring data storytelling out of pie in the sky stuff and just look at, some core tenets. So these are Ben's tenets, and you want to connect with people. You want to convey a simple idea and explore things you know best. So this example I thought was great to share was kind of in terms of specific technology-based projects that we're thinking about with VR and taking data-driven journalism steps further as well with civic engagement and use. This particular example was, fire hydrants mapped by the parking ticket revenue, in which he documented the story on his blog and visualized the open data, and then was able to take all this information to show us that indeed the DOP did make some efforts to kind of mark this parking spot. So as we think of VR and immersive media and web-based interactivity and data and who's creating the data, and how can we fast track through stories and interactivity data that is, making it visible, again, making it accessible to make improvements, and in this case, change our city for the better. You might have heard about the New York Times just partnership with Google. They distributed 1 million Google Cardboards last week with this project, The Displaced. And so iterating on data-driven journalism as well, what we're seeing in terms of immersive journalism and the ability to download directly onto and view in your smartphone on a Google Cardboard, a fully immersive experience. Another project I just want to bring up quickly, SoundSelf, which is a VR project that is designed by Robin Arnott and is experimenting with meditation use and biofeedback, so data around input and breathing. There's lots of research around VR for reduction or treating PTSD, reduction in stress. And this brings to mind thinking about data around personal data and also things like the Internet of Things and wearables. And virtual reality is a wearable. It is a head-mounted interface. So in closing, I just want to mention, projects that we're working on right now is to think about how we can take data-driven storytelling around projects that are meant to build empathy, but for a reason, to create action. And I think there's a lot of work to be done now in terms of research and the interface design and thinking about the visualization and that narrative and the context between between immersive media and the real world. So those are some things we're working on prototyping right now to make effective partnerships with publishers and with municipalities and the like to come up with some prototypes that demonstrate visualizations in VR that are demonstrating a great use of discovery around data, but also decision-making tools. So we're taking a lot of that thinking in terms of big data and analytics and designing that for immersive experiences. So this is our studio, Datavized, and these are some of the kind of things we're up to right now. So I brought a demo with me of the project information, and be happy to show you guys after our talks tonight. Thank you.
So our third panelist is Jen Beagle. Jen Beagle runs a storytelling group called Story Forward, and I invited Jen because I wanted her to talk about the other end of it from a content perspective on how to make this data more accessible, because these two are both technologists, and they're very much into the art and the craft of the data itself. But from a user's perspective, a lot of people are not as knowledgeable about data. So I was hoping, Jen, that you could speak to us more about your experience with storytelling and speaking to the audience at their level.
Yeah, so can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. So yeah, I'm a transmedia producer and a digital marketing strategist. So I walk the line between actually telling story and, seeing what the audience is engaging with, and then taking the data and bringing the data back to the creative the creative team to see how we're going to move forward with a project. For instance, actually, is anybody online? Because I was going to pull up I have an older deck. It's a Prezi, and but it's got some of this kind of data storytelling in it, and I think it's a little bit easier to see instead of tell. Go to my website, jlbhartmedia.com, and then go to down to Works, and then you can pull up the Prezi directly from there.
So why don't you?
Okay, so I would not consider myself so much a data person as someone who really instead looks at community engagement, and that is a numbers game. We look very much at how an audience engages with a property, what they are interested in, what they're bringing to the table, and what they're sending back to us. So if you go to when you're telling a story nowadays, you really have to have some data behind it. It's under, I think it's under, no, it's up at the top. Go to services, I'm sorry, transmedia storytelling. And then there should be a Prezi that should pop up. There we go. Okay. There's a lot of fluff in there. Yep. What do I point at?
You don't need to point at anything.
Okay. I think, there we go. Is it? Yeah, I need to, there we go. Sorry, I can't find, I saw it.
You're on my screen now, so go back to the right.
Back to the right.
You're still on my screen. Go right more.
There.
You see it? Oh, you're back on my screen.
It's weird.
There you go.
Okay,
See the
there it
circle?
is. Yep.
There you go.
All right. No. I know, I'm trying to see it. Sorry. Eric, just hit enter for me, and then it should be able to. Because I can't. All right, can't drive from here. Sorry. So anyway, who here's heard of transmedia? Raise your hand if you've heard of transmedia storytelling. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what transmedia, let's see if you can. Transmedia storytelling is basically it's telling a story across multiple platforms. That's the simplest way of telling it. However, in the more complex definition would be using a tentpole piece, say a film or a book, and providing separate storylines. There. Oh, now we're in. It's not expanding though.
Operate it with the scroll wheel. Oh, you want to make it?
Yeah. Can we make it full screen? Here we go. Awesome. All right. So the scroll wheel. Just the scroll wheel. Okay.
As
So.
long as you keep the mouse on that screen, you should be fine.
All right.
I was using the scroll wheel to move. Click. Try clicking on it. No, use the scroll wheel. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. Technology, gotta love it. All right, so there we go. It's hanging itself. All right, just hit enter. It should just go. There should just be a button. I don't know why it's stuck. All right. Anyway, so transmedia storytelling is telling a story across multiple platforms. Usually the story has different lines that come in and they support each other, kind of like a tent. So you have a tent pole piece, looks a little bit, like a film, a book, a comic book series, and then you'll have other lines coming in and supporting that tent pole, whether it be web series, it's a novel, a graphic novel, and it's primarily a sub storyline that can be enjoyed by itself, or it can be part of the overall narrative. So when we're talking about transmedia and creating for transmedia, we have to know what the data and the metrics are to determine what storylines are working. So if you're looking at, say, the tentpole piece, and it's the main engagement is women aged 25 to 34. Well, we're not going to create a video game that's aimed at 14-year-old boys. We're going to make sure that additional tentpole piece is geared towards women in that age range. Some people would say, well, don't you want to expand your audience? Well, of course we do, but the issue being that you want to make sure that you stick with your data points so that you can increase visibility and create stickiness for your content. So it's not gonna. There we go. I can get up there. I just wanted to get to some numbers. So another thing we use when we talk about numbers is we also take a look at the types of devices that people are on. So when you're creating for transmedia is going to happen across multiple platforms. So what are the devices that people are using? So, is our audience primarily on Apple? Are they on Android? Are they Mac users? Are they do they use PCs? Are they, do they consume at home? Do they consume in theater? So these are another big data points that we take a look at as we're developing for, multi-platform projects. And I have those numbers, right? Yeah. So this is just some video statistics. I was working for, anybody remember social TV? Anybody ever used social TV? Raise your hand if you used a social TV app, or if you've used a social TV app within the past 6 months. All right, so social TV failed. And this is why. When I was working with social TV, I was working with an app called Umami, and we were doing a lot of measurement trying to figure out where the audience was. And one of the biggest problems we kept running up against was the audience kept moving, and it was not something that we could really market to in a cohesive way. So when you're a small startup company, you want to be able to use, data effectively to get your your voice out. But if your audience is so scattered, it's very, very difficult to do ad buys, to do any sort of outreach. So, here we are trying to tell our brand story, while also using social TV to tell, digital stories, to tell, television stories, and increase, audience engagement with these properties, and we don't even know how to get them because we're having a hard time discerning who's on these devices, how many people are accessing these devices. And a lot of times we were getting like false reports, because if you would maybe download the app, you're not always going to turn it on. You're not always going to be next to your phone. Nowadays, we're much more digital savvy. We always have these next to us. But the whole idea of the social TV apps early on was they were primarily tablet focused, especially with the content, because the amount of content that we were creating for these apps was just astronomical. It was very hard to engage with it and watch it on a mobile device. So the tablet was our home, and our data just kept crashing because we couldn't figure out how to get the audience to get back to that tablet. So I think, why does it keep going out? Here, I'll use so one of the projects I worked on was a project called Zenith. This was a pure transmedia project that actually we had a guerrilla transmedia campaign. The film, the initial film was called Zenith, and we developed a transmedia campaign around Zenith called Stop Zenith. Stop Zenith had 60 supporting websites. It had 12 supporting online characters that each had Twitter profiles and Facebook pages. We also had live events. We did a guerrilla postering campaign, and I'm trying to remember the one we did. And then we did banner buys that were supporting the messaging of the websites. So we created this whole story. Well, one of the big things we had to do afterwards was then we had to take a look at how many, what the numbers were, to make sure that, we had reached the target audience, which we did. Then the numbers afterwards, because what we wanted to do is we were doing an alternate distribution. Everybody know what I mean when I say alternate distribution? It's Netflix, anything that's online, iTunes. We ended up running a Vodo campaign, and a campaign on Pirate Bay, and after we ran this whole campaign, the Stop Zenith campaign, we basically had to decide if it was worth us running the campaign. And within the first 6 months, we had 1.6 million downloads on Vodo, which told us that our campaign worked. Which is for a film that had no money behind it and had no had no ad buys and no spend to get it up online. And to date on Netflix, these are old. We have 500,000 views on Netflix. So this is just a kind of way that we use data. I come from the marketing background, but we also use it in terms of telling the cohesive story back to the audience so that we know how to engage with them better. So.
All right. Thank you very much. So one of the things that interests me about this topic is the idea of I'm really fascinated by people who tell stories that have a narrative structure, but also use data. So as Erica pointed out, the data-driven journalism, as Debra uses in her work with Datavized, and her documentary information is fantastic for this. And how what Jen was describing with using multiple different mediums. So when we're looking at a piece of work, a piece of culture, a film, or that sort of thing, we don't want to see the scaffolding that makes it work. We want to be sucked into the story. And so what I'm really interested in here is how we can use data using, like what she was saying, maximizing your data inc, or telling a story telling one thing very simply and clearly, how that can work in a larger story and a larger narrative. So who would like to go first?
I
All right.
I could start freestyling on that, I guess. So data in a bigger story. I mean, I think the idea of that sort of, even the idea of the documentary, sort of, the original concept of like documenting the world and, conveying reality, because obviously, not to get too philosophical here, but there's no such thing as objectivity. I mean, even in my world of making a data graphic, you aspire for it, but of course, as soon as you start categorizing data, you're limiting the world of that data, right? I mean, that's why the census model always wigs me out, where it's like, even just with racism, like, black, white, Hispanic, Caucasian, it's like, whoa, that's it? That's the known universe? It's like, well, no, that's the universe we're choosing to look at. So I guess the thing is that storytelling, of course, is subjective, and even data graphics or data storytelling is subjective, because, hey, we're human, and that's just how it works. So, I mean, I love the idea of, like I said, again, the data journalism aspect, where you acknowledge that it's going to be subjective, but at least you give the opportunity for multiple vantage points, I guess. So by providing the raw data, or putting it in the context of a bigger, say, piece of journalism or a documentary or a film or whatever it is, you increase the opportunity for multiple vantage points from your vantage point, I guess. Drop the mic, I don't know, next.
I'll riff off just the scaffolding infrastructure comment, because I think with immersive media and designing immersive experiences where, again, the agency of the individual has tremendous potential for in immersive media to kind of visualize very complex, data sets, and visualize that in perhaps ways in which we're increasing, our natural ability as humans to recognize patterns and drive that in more meaningful ways through media. But I kind of see the infrastructure aspect as, maybe visualizing that in a way, in the sense it's kind of more like the metadata that's swimming around, that we're trying to make sense of it. And I think if we're designing with immersive media in mind, and kind of making efforts to kind of, through the open data movement, through storytelling efforts, kind of connect that in meaningful ways with immersive media, is just thinking of that as, how can we let some of the machines and systems do the bulk of that work, and design systems that are human centric, so that those stories reach people and create conversation and action.
Define data. I mean, because my idea of data and maybe their idea of data is very different. I mean, from a marketing standpoint, data for me is analytics. I use Hootsuite, Facebook, Simply Measured. Like, I measure interaction. That for me is my cornerstone. That's what makes that's my job. My job is to see how people, from click-through rates to open, to email opens, and then from that standpoint, then I can tell a better branded story or a better narrative story. And, and the line is very blurred nowadays. I mean, when you're working in an agency, and you're working with a big brand, that brand has a story, and that brand may have a narrative, and that brand may want you then to tell the brand's narrative using, all of the touch points that you've accessed. So, data for me, means marketing, and I know that it's not, that like these two ladies, it's a very different thing, but from the marketing standpoint, I think that you can tell a very cohesive narrative. Whether you're selling Pepsi, or you're pitching a film, or you're creating a transmedia campaign, it all comes down to the numbers, and it all comes down to like where you get the numbers and how you've accessed them.
So from that perspective, thinking about how you measure your audience, what would you tell? What kind of feedback do you give back to your audience once you've measured them?
It depends on the property. Feedback may be extra content. If I have a very engaged audience, so for instance, there's a great show on Stars that I love called Black Sails, and Black Sails does a very simple but elegant newsletter campaign. They knew their audience, and they have been using this campaign, and one way that they've been able to hook people, I mean, I'm coming at it from an audience standpoint, but they've used this email campaign to keep my appetite whet and to keep me coming back for more, reminding me that the show is coming on, reminding me that there's additional content, and then they'll slide you additional content. And the more you engage with it, the more content you're going to get. So, as storytellers and story consumers, we're always looking to get deeper into a story we love. And, me as the marketer or the creator, I want to give back to that audience the deeper they engage. So, for instance, if I have a movie and I have a website about the movie, so people may go see the movie, they may go to the website then after the movie to learn more about it. If they go to that website, I want to give them a little extra piece. I want to give them more content. And what that does, it allows me to take that data and see how many people click through that website, how many people engaged with it. And then maybe, if there's enough engagement, maybe then I put up additional content. I add them to a newsletter list. I send them more content. So then it becomes a very two-way street. They give me their email, I give them content in return. And, the more you can engage, the more, the deeper you can go down that rabbit hole, so to speak, with your audience, the more you've got them hooked, the more you've got them entertained. And, that's all data. We are all, using is it worth my time and effort to create that additional content? Do I have enough eyeballs looking at it? And, and then, that comes then back to ad buying and spends and can I present that to a brand that's going to then wrap themselves around it.
So looking at the from that same perspective into the data-driven journalism, Erica, you gave that example of the WikiLeaks on the Iraq War statistics. Now, in just that one slide, if you were to take that one slide and turn it into prose, that would be a long-form article of several thousand words, which would take an hour to read. So, looking at that slide, I can take all of that information in about 5 minutes, or I could spend an hour looking at all of those data points and do a really deep dive with that information. So. So how can we use data to tell those sorts of stories, in light of, say, the Paris attacks and everybody suddenly being much more aware of ISIS in Syria and the refugee crisis and all that kind of stuff. These really, really large stories that can only be told with using large data sets. How can we use that? How can we use that data to tell that story in the short amount of attention span that people have?
Well, I guess just like you touched on then, it's the great thing about mapping data is that it literally does that, right? It puts data sometimes on a map, like that slide that we looked at. And interestingly enough, it makes, I think, data more human. So by even looking at that graphic I showed you, which was a bad day in Iraq, you suddenly saw a city and you saw numbers of people dying in different places at different times of just that one day. And you could immediately, coming back to perhaps the empathy level, you could start to go, what if that was my city? And what if in just this one day, a couple of hundred people at dozens of sites were being shot, were being blown up, 2 degrees of separation. I probably know some of them. And it immediately takes the statistic of 210 people died today in Iraq to it was happening throughout a day, throughout a city, throughout marketplaces, throughout schools, throughout transportation systems, and it makes it more human, I think, to map the data and give it a layer or another axis, if you will, I guess. And I think also by putting it in a context, say something like the recent bombings in Paris, it would have the same effect. But ideally, I think data-driven journalism, a great part of it is that it encourages you to explore. And as I was saying before, perhaps get your own angle on the data or on the story. So whether that's something like clicking through to the data set because you want to see certain points in more detail, what happened at this town square, how many died, were they children, were they Parisian, were they Afghani? But also, urge you to perhaps then click through to go about other information that's related. Like maybe, for myself, even with the Paris attacks, I decided I didn't know enough about ISIS. So, wanted to delve deeper into the mindset of the belief system there. So I just think it encourages different pathways, and it also makes stories more human when you take data, because also humans are incredibly capable of pattern recognition. So we can actually take a lot of data. Even a person who perhaps considers themselves more left brain or right brain, the ability for the human eye, then brain, to recognize trends, recognize patterns, is immense. So by creating a landscape with data and not just giving people numbers, I think you take advantage of our already natural perception and encourage people to be more reflective, and also give a more human stance to what was previously just a series of numbers.
Just to add on the human scale and design of that in virtual reality and immersive media that we're designing for the web, and some of those prototypes is to provide interfaces where you have maybe a bird's eye view of a map, or in a breaking news case like the tragedy in Paris, be able to also then, we're building map-based visualizations that bring you to a street level. So from a bird's eye view into a street level, and going from 2D to 3D into a much more cinematic experience of information and stories. And again, from the big data context, collecting that into a framework that puts you, physically there. And in many ways, I think as far as our connectivity to what's happening in the world, and to be able to collectively and in real time contribute to getting the facts and sharing the facts and things of that nature, is going to be a really amazing kind of use case if we're starting to use these technologies in those ways. Another example is we're working on some disaster relief emergency response prototypes for humanitarian use. So the case of Nepal and the earthquake, we're taking 3D point cloud, very complex data structures, to again bring them into immersive environments and open up those data sets beyond just researchers to look at and study and analyze, and provide the ability to annotate them, to provide a space for distributed collaboration. So the more connectivity, the ease of use, and reducing friction into those kinds of environments, and ones that are extremely compelling in terms of creating immersion and sense of presence, are some of the things we're thinking about. And as Erica said, in terms of the ability for pattern recognition, if you haven't tried VR or starting to look at content with live video action and multimedia, again, it's an increase of the sensory bandwidth that we're just at the beginning of really experimenting with, and have just scratched the surface around what does big data look like in immersive media.
So, based on that idea, something that comes out to me is the idea of a data-driven documentary. So, I'm the sort of person that will be on the internet, and I will absorb my information sort of devoid of an empathetic context. A lot of times I'll read articles, I'll look at data sets, I'll look at maps and that sort of thing. But then you'll sit down and you see a documentary, like I watched Inside Assad's Syria on Frontline, and this is one of the most touching documentaries about this subject that I've ever seen. And there's a new form of documentary that is data driven, such as 18 Days in Egypt and Do Not Track that she mentioned before, where you get the best of both worlds. And now it's a pretty nascent form of storytelling, so the language of that film hasn't really developed yet, but being able to take that bird's eye view of the whole, and then the small points of empathy with a real individual and how it affects them, how can we tell those stories? Do any of you have any ideas?
That's what we're trying to experiment with the new medium in terms of, I think, looking at these successful Bear 71, 18 Days in Egypt, and what was really compelling around, the creative use of the technology, and in terms of, Do Not Track, the data, the content is the data, of what your input and your output is all connected in that sense. So this kind of collapse between what's maybe visible or invisible between, depending on the context, of course. But I think for good data-driven narrative and storytelling, you're thinking about, a series of compelling stories within a much more complex system structure for a broader narrative, and in that case, when you're designing projects that we were doing around global development or social issues, there's a series of kind of testing and prototyping to begin to kind of understand all of these facets. And keep in mind that with immersive media in particular, you're dealing with an entirely new set of input data from the user, head tracking, where they're looking, for how long. There's some heat map based tools that are already coming out for these kinds of platforms, eye tracking as the next thing. So there's, and then of course, as I mentioned, the ability for gestural enabled inputs and all these things. So, it's really a paradigm shift. And as Mark Zuckerberg said when he purchased Oculus, this is a new communications platform. He didn't say this is a new way for shoot 'em up games. It is literally a paradigm shift around communication and it's up to all of us to kind of really test and figure out how we want that system to look like in the future.
Yeah, so there was a project I got to work on, and it wasn't so much a documentary as it was an experiential learning project called Robot Heart Stories with Lance Weiler, who's the creator. And we started out as 50 collaborators, and we came together to focus on Lance's big vision of how to reboot education. And the story was we had a middle school in Canada where this plush robot crash lands into the school, and the students then take the robot and they create stories for her. They create a background for her. They give her a name. They give her an identity, and they do it across medium. They do it with video. They do it with a Tumblr blog. They do it with Twitter. And what our job was as the collaborators was then to take all of this data that the students had created, repackage it into a core curriculum, and then take that curriculum across the United States and then use this data, let the students in the next school then take the next step further. We collected that data. We went to the next school, collected that data, and we finished up at the end in a school in Los Angeles where we had all of this data that the students could use, the teachers could use to teach the curriculum. And they then were able to create a story based upon how to get her home. And so she had this very rich narrative behind her that had been created across two countries countries and across 18 states. And, it's not, electronic data, but, it was, a lot of it was very hard data. Like we were, handwriting curriculums, we were handwriting these documents, and we had, video, we had online, we had offline, but it was the data that did tell the story of the robot Leica, and we used that to just encapsulate what she was, and that helped to create this new curriculum for teachers to use.
I guess also continuing on sort of both points there, it's just I think it's going to become increasingly important and popular to bring gamification into the navigation of data sets. So it's kind of like, when you think about game design, I'm not a gamer, but you can appreciate the fact that they're creating a world with infinite options for people to go through, and somehow at the same time orchestrate spikes in adrenaline and interest in stories and all of that. So if you can bring that same sort of infinite pathways approach to data sets, but in a way that is, useful, whether that's educational or whether it's exploring a landscape or the human body or whatever it is, that will be a great meeting of skill sets. And I know, for example, the director of Grand Theft Auto, he's coming out with a new game at the moment called 1979: The Revolution. He's from Iran, and he left with his family when he was a child during the civil revolution of 1979. So he's decided now he's created a game, an immersive, all bells and whistles game on apps based games, not a PS1 or anything, but to educate people on the Iranian civil revolution of 1979, to give different viewpoints, whether it's to be a militia, to be a journalist, to be a protesting student, using that like real world experience with a gaming narrative approach. And so it will probably become increasingly useful to explore data sets with a gamification approach.
So one last question that I have to tie some of the themes together before I take it to a Q&A. So 18 Days in Egypt was crowdsourced from experiences people had in Tahrir Square. So Jen was talking about tracking all the different user behaviors, and Debra mentioned how all these different user behaviors can be. You can track even more of that with like head tilt and that sort of thing. Erica talking about designing data visualizations and how to use that data. So what I wanted to ask about is how close to real time can we get in terms of crowdsourcing data, in terms of interactivity, so that we as a creator of the experience are not having to source all the data ourselves, but our users are bringing that in, and what kind of results can we expect from that kind of interactivity?
I think in terms of designing systems, maybe you could speak for the information architecture better than I can, but for VR, I think some of the things we're thinking about in terms of crowdsourcing, wisdom of the crowds, and as I mentioned, these kind of annotation tools is, the accessibility and democratization of obviously access to data. In many ways, we're still on that open data movement. There's a lot to be done in the sense of taking 3D data models from NASA or museum collections or what have you, and making them accessible for more immersive, meaningful experiences. So those are things we're starting to build tools to, through coding and software to kind of open these rich data sets, 3D models, and create in many ways like the documentation and educational materials provide kind of more accessible web portals for user interfaces for VR. So I can just speak to specifically for like a web VR project, to be able to kind of not just create a few lines of code to map an environment, and but next phases is to easily pull in multimedia data. If you look at YouTube now, it is now capable for stereoscopic video. So we're thinking about this kind of data and how we're going to be interfacing with and want to engage with those immersive experiences, but also in this kind of transition from 2D to 3D, use the crowdsourcing tools, and meaning from the open source community or tools that are designed specifically for kind of co-creation, like annotation and those kinds of experiences, in which you as the individual are contributing to the research, or the in the case of the Nepal earthquakes, to more efficiently map the areas that need repair, and working with the community kind of directly. So I think there's a lot of just drawing inspiration from the open web and open source communities and applying that to data-driven design and storytelling and whatever kind of project you might have.
I guess I'm quite fascinated with all the data flying around, basically everything. If you think about the old Snowden NSA leaks, that anything that you are doing online on your phone, any connection you have with the data pipe is essentially tracked. It's not that they're out to get you, but they just, anything you do in a browser window is tracked. Like, unless you're using a browser like Tor or something like that, everything you do is getting noticed, or at least getting recorded. So I guess for me, it's kind of like, increasingly we have to let people opt out of that. Like, people have the right to not be tracked. But right now there's a huge amount of data flowing around about opinions. Like, increasingly we have things like natural language processing, so we know what dialogue is, we know what people are saying about all sorts of things. So I think it's fascinating to get real world temperature checks on what are people thinking and doing and commenting on. What does America think about gay marriage? What does China think about climate change? Like, what's the conversation that is happening in real time that we do actually have access to? Well, at least governments have access to. I would like to increasingly get more people that data anonymized and accessed by anyone who wants to investigate what the people of the world are thinking. But if you think about even like the Arab Spring, again, I'm not a huge Twitter person either, but I think it's an amazing tool. But when you think about the Arab Spring was called the Facebook Revolution, not because Facebook allowed it to happen, but Facebook and social media like Twitter allowed it to scale its coordination abilities. And so if you think about that, like all the dialogue that was involved on Facebook and Twitter around the times of the Arab Spring, all that's there and documented, and what thousands of people were thinking and doing and saying and coordinating, where the rallies were, what photos of those rallies were. Like, it's an amazingly source mapped revolution. So the stories are there, and also, even if it's nothing as major as the Arab Spring, maybe if it is a dialogue about drones in Syria, like that, the dialogue is there. It's just about working out how you want to surf it, and if you want to create interfaces, or you just want to create your own, traditional stories, like through newspapers or movies or whatever, but use it from crowdsourced, real world, real time data flows.
Just to add to that, I mean, I've worked in newsrooms, and I've worked. Collection of data live is already it's already happened. I mean, it happened 15 years ago. It happened 20 years ago. We're getting live data. It's what it really comes down to is the size of your team. And it's the size of your servers, like being able to process the data. That's really all it comes down to. I mean, we're collecting data on a scale that it's unfathomable how much data is collected on each and every single one of us on a daily basis. And from this, from that, from just walking into a store, data is collected on us constantly, and that data can be mined by anybody, pretty much. If you have access to those servers, you have access to that, and to that link. I could paint an entire picture of Debra or of Erica or of Eric. And I can paint like I could pull down any data I want and tell you, your who you are, what you do, what you watch, and I'm, not a company. I'm just a single person, but there is that much data out there. So the data mining has already happened. The revolution now needs to happen, that we need to be able to stop being tracked.
All right, I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? Here in the back, would you like to stand up and, hey, how you doing?
Okay, my question is, I wish to influence the flow of data. Let's say I have a story and I want to take it from a sad ending to a happy ending. What would I do?
It's a tough question.
Cats. Definitely cats should be in there.
Cats.
Maybe small hedgehogs.
Okay, so cute things.
Yes.
So go on, you go.
No. So do you want to take so let me just get. You want to take you want to find out what the audience wants? Do they want a happy ending or a sad ending? Is that what you're asking?
I guess it's more my tyrannical decision that I wanted a happy ending, and then how would I collect people who wanted the happy ending?
So you would use probably. I mean, if you're making if you're making an interactive piece, use a platform like Interlude or their Treehouse campaign, and then you would create the video with two separate endings. You could do it on YouTube as well. Create a movie with two separate endings, and then you can judge. Who decides which one is the better ending, and then you have you capture their responses at the end. I mean, that's a simple. We started doing that about 5 years ago, 6, 7, 8.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Right up here in the front.
Thanks, Eric, for organizing this panel. I think it was interesting and insightful discussion. I know that you wanted us to stay away from the technicalities behind the visualization, but I would like us to go around the panelists and just to share with us which types of data visualization tools or scripting languages you're using for some of the examples that you've quoted or you shared tonight with us. Thank you.
Yeah, we use D3.js primarily, exclusively, in fact, at least in the application, the CodeClear application that we developed. And the New York Times, the examples I showed were also D3.js.
For virtual reality, essentially, Brian Charles, who is my partner and CTO, designed something called the Web VR Starter Kit. So that is a wrapper in which you can work in the browser to prototype virtual reality data visualizations with a few lines of code, and as I mentioned, kind of working on pulling in and accessing 3D models and things of that nature quickly and more efficiently. There's a project called Virtual Reality Cities for WebVR, and that example of a prototype is just importing census data into the prototype. So I'm a big fan of just kind of scouring and researching open source tools because there's so many out there and there's so many repositories as far as favorite kinds of tools, open source tools. But I mean, from anything from your open office to Tableau to, what have you, CartoDB, any of these mapping tools or open source tools, I think are just really fun and to get your hands on prototyping and working on visualization exercises. But with VR specifically, there's very few, I think, out there right now. So the Web VR Starter Kit is kind of a first step, and we're building on top of that right now.
Is that using OpenGL?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
No.
Go ahead.
No, it's just it for me. It depends on my client. That's it.
Yeah, I was going to bring up OpenGL because OpenGL is a really cool it's a 3D vector graphics for a web that runs in a web browser. So it draws the 3D objects in real time based on your data points, which is really cool. So, do we have any other questions? Brian? Okay. Here you go.
I'm going to try to phrase this, but I'm still figuring this out. So, what sort of techniques or heuristics do you use to sort of map like data, like let's say intensity of a large data set, and to biofeedback or emotions? Or are there like kind of tips that you have, or kind of little pointers?
I can point to like some examples and experiences in terms of like SoundSelf that I mentioned as a project that is like a meditation app in which you input in terms of your breathing. So it's an early prototype, but essentially has a head-mounted display, Oculus Rift kind of setup, but is playing around with different kind of skin sensor technologies, EEG recognition. There's a platform called OpenBCI, which I've been looking at, which is using kind of 3D printing to iterate on head-mounted display technology, and kind of robotics and engineered type experiences like that. I think as these kind of consumer-facing wearables, ultimately through hackers and kind of finding, meaningful and accessible ways for that kind of input evolves, that will be some pretty interesting ways to kind of visualize emotion and again, like VR in terms of a stress reducer, maybe we'll have an ad targeted to us or something that's like, you need to bring your stress level down at work, or Google's creating, some prototypes around kind of the attention economy and time well spent and these various things. So I think we'll see kind of more of that experimentation, and in terms of our personal data input and what we choose or not choose is kind of irrelevant because, we don't really own our data. So I think that the choices around the experiences and what we want to design for and gain meaningful experiences out of is kind of what's key. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, to add to what Debra just said about the using EEGs and that sort of thing, in the panel that we had on augmented reality a couple of months ago, we had someone from Dacry, which is a company that makes these helmets that are they have a heads-up display. They have 6 different cameras for 360-degree vision, and what they're aiming at is the industrial market, so that they can do data overlays on what's going on around you. But they also bought an EEG company so that they could put EEG nodes in the helmet so that it can actually tell them, so like say your worker hasn't had any water for a while and they're getting dehydrated, they can get a warning on their screen saying you need to hydrate or you're going to pass out. Working in an oil field out in the middle of the UAE or something. So a lot of that technology is moving very quickly. It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, there's a is this still on? There's a website called datamade.us. Sorry, my browser Wi-Fi is not working, but I think they have a great list on there in terms of some projects that are showing open source tools and visualization tools. But yeah, I don't know of any kind of one, just back to that question, one like portal, but if anyone here comes across one and tweets it out, that would be nice.
All right, so this is going to be either our last question or our last 2 questions. Okay, I've seen 2 hands raised, and so you here in the front, and Max, you wanted to? Okay, so we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Max, and then we'll close it out. Here you go.
What would you suggest as the best program for VR for architectural interior movies and 3D modeling? And would it be for a Mac or PC, or is there one for, specifically for either?
I know a couple companies like Iris VR who are building, their startup building tools for real estate and architecture and kind of CAD imagery into VR models. So they're good to look at. And we're looking and inspired by Matterport VR and things like Project Tango from Google in terms of scanning technologies. Actually, Caitlin was just at the gaming conference playing with it today, very jealous. So yeah, I think looking at some of those trends with consumer devices that will allow you to kind of quickly scan an environment around you or rooms. I'm seeing some other startups that are doing things around like interior design and using machine learning and kind of at scale for creating 3D models. And Iris is a good example, though, for kind of architecture and VR models.
Oh, great, thank you.
All right, Max?
I was just wondering, like, how far away, it seems like a lot of these technologies are still kind of, maybe the experimental phase isn't exactly right, but they're still tools for professionals, really. Consumers are able to watch stories or input their data, and then the stories are created from data they input. But how far are we from being able to make our own virtual reality films as easily as we shoot a YouTube video on our phone?
I honestly don't think we're that far off. The technology is moving so quickly, and I want to be in the camp that's like building exactly those tools to democratize them, which is why we're focusing on web VR and things like rendering in the browser and making that accessible so we can use our interfaces and these very expensive laptops we all maybe purchased, or use that for building and designing for the immersive experiences, and also tools that will enable you to be within a device, a cardboard, and be editing in kind of in that interface, or using that as a tool we're looking at is something like vid code and some other where you have a preview screen and you're looking at what you're building in real time, and you can publish that and share that easily on the web, and also have as the distribution platforms become launched, and the one that my film will be on is called Evo, so that will be out, and as more access for content creators to have platform access for distribution. That's going to be something they're coming out with some tools for conditional narratives and all these other fun things. And just as far as the consumer market, the Samsung Gear is already available in Best Buy, and the price is dropping by the week. So it's for Thanksgiving, it's going to be $99. It'll be half as much as it was 30 days ago. And of course, you have to have a Samsung phone, maybe a pretty expensive phone. But that's why we're looking at things like Google Cardboard and those other accessible or 3D printed or different Google Cardboard designs that you could make yourself for the hard cost of $4 between some cardboard and lenses. So.
The other thing I want to add to that is actually we're going to at some point be having a panel talking a little bit deeper about this for creators, is the storytelling aspect. And with new technologies comes a whole new language and a whole new toolkit, which, if you're a traditional filmmaker, creating and writing a script for VR in the beginning is going to be very difficult. It's going to be clunky. It's going to not feel, natural. Right now you have a lot of, designers and game developers, and they're creating for but they're not creating traditional narrative, And so if you work in traditional narrative, how then do you take that your narrative and put it into a VR space without it feeling like you're just tacking it on. So this is another thing that we're working on overcoming, and it's a big conversation that's happening, and people are trying to work it out. And I think that once you have the marriage of the accessibility of the technology, and you have the new language for the content creators and the storytellers, they'll come together, and then we're going to see this then just start rolling out much more, much faster.
All right, for some closing remarks, I'd like to ask the question, what most excites you about the future of your industry, of where you think things are going?
Actually, I'm really excited about VR and AR. Because it's two new technologies that we get to create narrative for, and we get to create more immersive story worlds.
I agree. Kind of everything with regards to immersive media, because it's so new and there's so many areas of research and exploration. It's a new frontier. So I think if anything intrigues you about VR, that stick with that curiosity. And as far as storytelling tools, I think creating, right now a sense of, which is why I made this film Information, was to spark a conversation about what the potential of VR can be. So I don't think there's enough of that right now. And there's a lot of examples, like the high production value content, costs are very high to do these things, but more discussion around building around tools like Unity or WebVR and design. So that's what is exciting me in the short term, but also that this is kind of here to stay and is going to be a pretty a paradigm shift that no one really knows the shape it's going to take. But I think that we have the ability as creators and designers and storytellers, whatever industry you're in, to literally contribute to designing the future of the medium.
I'm beginning some research on systemic deliberative democracy, because I think in a world of networks and digital tools, it's kind of ridiculous that democracy looks like voting on a piece of paper once every 4 years. So I'm interested in how to improve urban governance by involving citizens in the policy deliberation process and informing urban planning and policy decisions, which involves educating citizens on the issues of a matter, and ideally using data visualizations and digital communication tools to make policy engagement frictionless but effective.
That's very interesting, because that problem is exactly what got me into the data field. Yeah. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. I hope it was engaging and informative. If you would like to learn,
you want to play with that thing?
Yeah. If you'd like to learn about more events, you can visit us at meetup.com, Pax Solaria, PAXSOLARIA. Debra, for the next couple of minutes, will have some demos of her documentary Information on her Samsung Gear. So if you'd like to learn more about that, stick around. Thanks.